It's been a while, but the year is almost over, and now I have time to post a deck about a new Christmas-colored god in the new year. It will be released in the new year, but I'm making the deck now, you know what I mean. I don't know how to pronounce her name. I'll call her Klothys, God of Destiny, 3 mana, red, green, indestructible, legendary, enchantment creature god. That's a 4/5 creature if you have devotion to red and green greater than 7, which means that's a lot of mana symbols that are green and red on the battlefield. It's not for new players. I ain't explaining all this shit. That was a mouthful. She's gonna be our commander. So what's the main draw? The interesting ability we want to see. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, exile target card from a yard. Any yard, by the way. If you exile a land, you add green or red to your mana pool. Single type. Note that this empties between phases, so can't really just save it up for later. This can be pretty awkward as it actually encourages you to cast spells before combat, so I don't suggest the typical Gruul build and turning this into aggressive Gruul smashy kind of build. I actually appreciate veering away from that direction, in fact. Second ability is if you exile a non-land card, you gain 2 life and each opponent is dealt 2 points of damage. Once again, reaffirming that Black's drain abilities are overpowered because it takes 2 to 3 other colors to get a similar effect, though this damage is dealt and not lost. This is strangely advantageous in this deck that we'll look at today. Not as much as the original version of the deck. The original version emphasized the idea of double damage and adding to damage on a passive way. The deck's goal is important, and this one's kind of weird. Of course, it's about getting cards into your graveyard. It makes some sense. It might be better with black, but I welcome this change. It's a nice pace breaker. It isn't about brokenly cheating a horde of giant fucking kaiju into play immediately. It's about grinding. Grind. You discard and cycle them back into your hand, rinse and repeat. Primarily, you want lands back in your hand more than anything else, since exiling non-land cards in your graveyard gets you good results, while you can re-discard land cards a lot more easily in this deck. Meanwhile, the non-land cards will probably just end up in your graveyard because you played them or self-mill. Maybe some discard, but once again, you're not going to be reusing non-land cards as much as lands. So let's talk about those lands. In many decks, lands don't do anything flashy. You play the game, that's it. Well, you're gonna need those expensive lands called fetch lands. I know, right? This is not a budget deck at all. I mean, there's a few options. There are a ton of colorless and utility lands, so these fetch lands are also going to be important to take advantage of lands that can activate some cute little abilities. You have all the Onslaught and Zendikar fetch lands that can grab a mountain or a forest. So, it's pretty likely each game you're going to start out with a Stomping Ground in play. It's both a mountain and a forest, and usually it won't come into play tap. The fetched lands also provide lands in the graveyard, which is also very important. Undiscovered Paradise, Gruul Turf, and Ghost Town are ways to get lands back in your hand to discard. Strip Mine and Wasteland they're for being a dick. Let's be real for a second. We have no lands or anything in this deck that is explicit graveyard hate, aside from Scavenging Ooze and our commander, because they hate on the graveyard while actually progressing our game plan. I like the lack of tempo loss there. I know it's probably not objectively speaking more powerful to just exile one at a time, but once again, I like the lack of tempo loss of just progressing your game plan while also mitigating other graveyard players. Our commander is enough graveyard hate, given how many other slots I had to take out. One of the big reasons that lands are a huge sub-theme in this deck is that unlike other Jund and Gruul graveyard landless, we're using the non-land cards in our graveyard so we can fill the battlefield and our hand with lands. Example. It's kind of a confusing example. Let's say we have Stormbind, Torbrand, and our commander on the battlefield. We discard one card to deal 4 points of damage. The card was random, so we can't choose it in this situation. Our graveyard has 5 land cards and 5 non-land cards. We then play Splendid Reclamation. We then choose to exile a non-land card from it and deal another 4 points of damage and gain 2 life, because Torbran increased the damage output. Next turn, the god exiles a non-land card again. Each opponent is dealt 4 points of damage. We gain 2 life, thanks to Torbran once again. We then play Reap the Past. Since we played Splendid Reclamation last turn, we had 6 mana since we could have already activated Stormbind's ability and played a Splendid Reclamation in the same turn. That also means that 5 lands entered thanks to Splendid Reclamation. Okay, this means you have 11 lands on the battlefield. You use 7 to play Reap X5, which returns 5 cards, including one from Stormbind. And they are all non-land cards since, once again, Splendid Reclamation. Since Torbrand is in play, it deals 8 damage to target opponent, since you spent the other 4 mana on Stormbind's ability, again. See, this deck is grindy, but it also manages to sustain itself by dealing damage pretty reliably. It's not like you have easy to remove creatures all the time. Enchantments aren't as passively removed. Random discard isn't too much of a problem since we have so many ways of getting cards back. I must emphasize that our commander is not the win con. It's a very easy way to stay in the game. In fact, if anything, our commander is in the defensive category of our deck. We're a grindy deck, so we need ways to stay in the game. We might overextend and discard our whole hand just to deal a ton of damage to the whole table, and might not even have Ensnaring Bridge in play, which, by the way, would be a good thing to put in our deck. So everyone will be annoyed with us. A lot of cards in our deck are triple or double red or green, and then once again, enchantment's not as easy to remove as creatures, so our commander just becomes the best blocker ever and invincibly chumps even the nastiest Death Toucher that attacks us. Our random discard burn kills creatures wanting to attack us sometimes. Seismic Assault and Ayula's Influence are really good ways to discard land cards in particular. Ayula's Influence is a nice way to make chump blockers. I elected for no Crucible of Worlds as Renin 6 gets lands into our hand, which is preferable than just playing from the graveyard, believe it or not. Sometimes a lot of little weird synergies in this deck. And having a Planeswalker with a nasty reputation is a good way for novice players to be like, oh god, he might ultimate, we're gonna die, kill him, attack him, and not the player. Also, he can ping small creatures. Chaos Warp, Boom Pile, Beast Within are our catch-all permanent. We dislike destruction. They have drawbacks, but not having a fill slot for every specific form of permanent destruction is preferred. I can't fucking speak, my god. No Kadama's Reach, no Cultivate. There's only 10 basics in our deck. They grab 20% of the basic lands in our deck each because, 2 out of 10 is 20%. That's how math works. After a while, this ends up blanking some of our top decks, which make fetch lands fucking horrible in the late game. We prefer fetch lands to actually be epic and nice. Genesis, Gigapede, Eternal Witness, Groundskeeper. They gradually grant card advantage over the course of the game in a more incremental fashion and just grab stuff from the graveyard. Grard. Maybe I should call it the Grard. To return to our hand. It's good given a commander game is typically slower. Wheel of Fortune and Magus of the Wheel are just giant card advantage explosions. Your hand is a resource in this game, so is your graveyard. These are absurd in this deck. Void Attendant and Turntimber Sower. Maybe it's Turntimber. Wow, it is, duh. Okay, Turntimber Sower allow you to take advantage of the exile that occurred due to Scavenging Ooze and your commander. And all the lands going in and out of the yard to make a lot of chump blockers. And of course, with Void Winnower's case, you can also ramp with these chump blockers if you so choose to start exiling cards from your opponent's graveyard. That's pretty much the deck. Discard, deal damage, return your graveyard to your hand. Rinse and repeat. It's more complicated than that, obviously, and it might be tedious having to keep track of everything you discard, return to your hand, everything in your graveyard, so this deck is in an awkward spot between too casual to be hyper competitive and too complicated and expensive for new players. Don't worry, there are replacements for stuff like Wheel of Fortune that are quite cheap, like Reforge the Soul. Ton of cards I left out in this deck, so I'm sure there's are plenty that you guys would prefer to replace. I didn't even mention how Gamble in this deck might as well be a one-mana demonic tutor, and Reap is in the main board because it's commander. Of course there are going to be blue and black cards in your opponent's graveyard. I have some of the cards up for sale on eBay below in the description if you'd like some big cards or some cards with the pizzazz to buy from there. So that can support the channel and maybe I can actually upload more than half a year at a time. Hey, it's better than me being like a fucking game reviewer and then saying, "This episode was sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. I am contractually obliged to not say how fucking terrible that game is because I'm fake." Bye guys, deck list and description, so is the eBay stuff. Hope you guys have a great 2020.